The ambiguous ending of Mr. and Mrs. Smith left viewers with a cliffhanger regarding the fates of protagonists John and Jane Smith. Based on how Amazon's television adaptation of Mr. and Mrs. Smith ended, there's no way of knowing for sure exactly what happened to Donald Glover's John and Maya Erskine's Jane. Glover's character was wounded in their safe room while Erskine's Jane only had one bullet left in her pistol as Parker Posey's super high risk Jane waited outside to strike. The 3 gunshots heard at the end of Mr. and Mrs. Smith indicate that both Posey and Erskine's Jane characters fired before the series cut to black. The most plausible outcome would be that Jane had fired her last bullet and missed, leaving Posey's character to fire 1 round at Erskine's Jane and 1 at Glover's John, effectively killing them both. If Mr. and Mrs. Smith returns for a highly anticipated but unannounced Season 2, it could see the return of Glover's John and Erskine's Jane through a number of specific situations. The 3 gunshots could mean John and Jane are still alive in Mr. and Mrs. Smith. The 3 gunshots heard at the end of Mr. and Mrs. Smith initially make it seem like the main John and Jane did not make it out alive. However, there are a few possible ways that both of them did end up surviving and could return in Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 2. The first shot could have been Erskine's Jane successfully hitting Posey's Jane, with the remaining 2 shots being the final confirmation that Posey's character was dead after Erskine's character picked up Posey's weapon. Alternatively, Posey's Jane could have shot first and missed, which allowed Erskine's Jane to use her one shot to make a fatal hit. Essentially, if Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 2 does end up happening, a situation that allows Erskine's character to save herself and Glover's John would have had to happen. There is, of course, the possibility that the series could take on a more anthological approach and feature completely new John and Janes, indicating that Glover and Erskine's character actually were killed in Season 1. Why Mr. and Mrs. Smith Season 2 should happen, with John and Jane returning. Jane, Maya Erskine, and John, Donald Glover, talking and smiling with other John in Mr. and Mrs. Smith. The ambiguous ending of Mr. and Mrs. Smith was thoughtfully crafted to cover all its bases, as it would make for a suitable ending if the Amazon project ends up being just a limited series. It doubly works as a cliffhanger for a potential Season 2 as well, especially considering that there is much more to explore with Glover's John and Erskine's Jane moving forward. Mr. and Mrs. Smith has wisely left all of its doors open, but the return of Glover's John and Erskine's Jane is certainly the most desirable outcome.